Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode of SCOTONOMICS. Thanks so much for joining us. Hello, Kieran. How are you doing?
I'm good. I've been watching or trying to watch Cory Booker. He's the name at the moment, and he did a massive filibuster in the Senate, so that's all good. Talking about the current administration.
Yeah. Huge issues there in the moment, isn't there? I mean, we at the festival, which we're going to discuss this evening, we didn't really mention Trump that often. You know, I think it was a big focus on the issues that were happening in Scotland and in the UK. Maybe the odd comment here or there. And that's what we're going to cover tonight. We're just going to look back at some of the highlights from the festival, which was almost 2 weeks ago now. I'm still catching up, editing the videos and getting other content and stuff from it. But we just wanted to kind of firstly say thanks to our 125 people who attended. We had some people joining us online, and we had a lot of people there in person. So thanks very much for your support again this year. I think it was one of the best conferences we've had in terms of content. I think the speakers that we managed to attract, Dundee, what they were talking about, the themes, I think really resonated with the audience. What would you think, Kieran?
Yeah, and certainly I think our speakers enjoyed it as well, from judging from the comments.
Yeah, we got really good feedback. I think some of them are used to going to really boring technical academic conferences, and at the festival they actually get to speak to real people, you know, not just other academics. And I think they get a lot of questions which are much more challenging than the kind of deep academic stuff that they get. So yeah, we're going to play some clips and show some of the highlights. But, you know, firstly, a formal thank you to everyone watching us on YouTube, on Facebook and Twitter, and also if we're streaming properly, which I think we are, to Twitch as well. Okay, right. Well, we've got 8 clips for you this evening. I'm going to vary between kind of 50 seconds and a few minutes. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to play a clip. I'd love to get your questions or feedback on this little clip. And then Kieran and I have a little bit of discussion, and then we'll play the next one. The first one I'm going to bring up was our opening session. And the first question of the festival, actually, I didn't really think we could have asked another opening question. And this was to Roz Foyer, who's the General Secretary at the Scottish STUC. And we asked her about Grangemouth. Your understanding of how we've got to where we are in terms of the refinery closing, and no one really seeing to be that there's that was likely to happen, or any kind of plan for that happening.
Yep. I mean, I think for me there is 2 stories to be told. There's a tale of what is happening, and there's a tale of what should be happening if we're serious about having a proper just transition for Grangemouth and for the workers of Grangemouth. It's a key part of our national energy security. That doesn't mean, you know, the workers haven't got their eyes shut to the future. There's a lot of trade unionists in Scotland who work in oil and gas, who work at places like Grangemouth, who work offshore. They don't have their eyes shut to the future. They understand that we need an energy transition, but what they want is a fair transition. They don't want to be flung on the scrap heap. They actually would quite like to be working in clean energy and green energy. And what we're really dealing with when it comes to Petroineos is a refinery, Scotland's only refinery, that is still absolutely vital, but it's owned jointly by the Chinese national government and a billionaire who.
So yeah, so some kind of key points, I think, from Roz there. The linking to the just transition, the idea that most of these workers can and want to translate their skills into the green economy, I think was really important. I know there was a point that you wanted to mention in that the wider sort of the extended interview that we had with Roz, because I really wanted to get to the bottom of where she thought the power lay, and we had an interesting conversation about that, didn't we, Kieran?
Yeah, so yes, you asked the audience towards the end of the interview, did they think that the Scottish Government was responsible? And no one put their hand up, the audience.
It was who's more responsible, the Scottish Government or the UK Government, and it was an overwhelming. And I think Roz was maybe not expecting that response from the audience, but from an audience that understand certainly currency and understand economics, it's clear that the majority, the levers for any kind of just transition and any industrial transformation lies with the currency issue, or lies with the central government. So hopefully we can follow up with with Roz on other issues. So any thoughts around that? Really interesting. We had a big chunk on Grangemouth. It's first 15-20 minutes actually. And if you really want to see that, you can jump onto our Patreon and you can access that episode. I'll put the link in the comments.
The other important thing to bring to attention to the Grangemouth closing as well is not just a loss of jobs, but of course oil really gains its value once it's refined. So if a country is producing oil, not refining it, it's really exporting a really raw product that only really gains real value once it's been refined. So that it really is a blow for Scotland, if we want to keep producing oil, and if we were running it ourselves, it wouldn't really be that great unless you have a refinery.
No, that is a really good point. And I think until last year, Nigeria, which is one of the largest exporters of crude oil, imported 100% of petrol. So that shows you it's exporting low value and importing high value. And that's the absolute worst position for any economy to be in. And that's what's going to happen. The final thing I'd say on that is, I think I said to Roz in the interview, so are you saying that the Chinese national government have more control of Grangemouth than either the UK or the Scottish government? And he said yes. Mm-hmm. And you're thinking there's something fundamentally wrong. How can you argue against that? Okay, well, please do any comments and thoughts. That would be great. Next, I'm going to show you a clip which some of you may have seen we've posted, and it's been retweeted quite a lot, and also on Blue Sky as well. It was a very short clip from Professor Danny Dorling talking about child poverty.
One country which has had the greatest rise in child poverty of all those which are measured, and it's the United Kingdom. The last thing I'll chuck in there, just as we're talking about the Scottish governments, you may not know this, when I started studying these things in the 1980s, I am old, Scotland had the worst child poverty rate in UK. The official child poverty rate now in Britain is lowest in Scotland. There is a higher rate of child poverty in the southeast of England, in Surrey, than in Scotland as a whole. So, yeah, a devolved administration can do something. That's all I'll say.
And that really re-emphasised one of the key points that I've been making this year and at the end of last year, is that there's a different ethical and moral standards in Holyrood when it comes to social security than there is in Westminster when it comes to welfare. And this was, highlighted by Danny throughout his presentations, was he was looking at how the UK government views welfare. And it all fits in perfectly to this completely neoliberal view that welfare is there and it stops people working and it demotivates people and it takes away their personal responsibility. Whereas the Scottish government, who are supportive of quite a few neoliberal ideas, have a very different take. And I think that's striking in that period of time to have a turnaround like that. And finally, his point, devolved governments can do things. And I think we should be really proud of what the Scottish government has done in this particular area around child poverty in Scotland. What do you think, Kieran?
Well, the Scottish government are busy trying to. I mean, this is a mitigation, really, what they're doing, because UK government are not really. They haven't implemented a proper and I mean, I hate that word, welfare, social security system. Certainly, when we compare it with our European neighbours, it's a really poor social security system. And, we're constantly mitigating for that, which means that we can't do the investment in other things because we're constantly having to protect our most vulnerable citizens from draconian policies from Westminster. Yeah. And they've just gotten a lot more draconian as well. So, it looks like we're going to be another 900 million down because of the recent changes to PIP.
Yeah, and that's just to give a tiny little bit of detail, that the Scottish government is given an equivalent block grant from social security or welfare spending at the UK level. So let's say the UK spends 100 billion on social security. Scotland gets a per capita percentage of that, and that's what we're supposed to allocate to social security. So if the Scottish Government wants to allocate any more than that, which it does, it has to take that money from another part of the budget, or it has to raise taxes and use those taxes to pay for it. So it has a huge impact. The decisions made at Westminster on welfare directly affect social security in Scotland, and there's only so much that the Scottish Government can do.
Yeah, and again, I want to point this out. I know I've pointed it out in other episodes, but it's relevant to this point that, the Westminster controls how much currency circulates in Scotland. The other side of that is the money coming up from Westminster is really not enough. But then also that they allow, through turning a blind eye to tax havenry, money to escape from the Scottish economy. And I know that at least 2 shopping centres in Aberdeen are they keep their profits in tax havens. So when someone rents a shop within that unit, when someone buys something from that shop, eventually, the profits from that will not recirculate around Aberdeen, Scotland, or the wider UK. It's not going to be involved in our economy anymore. And as long as Westminster allows that to happen, again, it restricts the amount of currency that can flow between people in Scotland.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. My final point, I've just been doing a little bit of research on this, is that on average over the last 20 years, £11 billion leaks out of the Scottish economy, in the sense that the money that we bring in financial flows is always on average 11 billion less than that leaves. And the majority of that money leaves is foreign direct investment taking their earnings out. So this idea that foreign direct investment is the way to grow the economy is clearly undermined by what's been happening in Scotland in the last 25 years. I mean, sometimes it's up to 20 billion leaving, exiting more than coming in. So it's about 11 billion on average. So these were some of the other issues that we covered in detail at the festival. We're not actually got a clip for that one, but I am going to move on to, I think, one of the best sessions that we had. And it was really popular in terms of questions. I remember asking 5 or 6 and then saying any questions, and about 20 hands went up. And this is a session that Andy Whiteman had with Brett Christophers when we spoke about who owns Scotland. Now I'm going to play you a clip now, and I asked Andy, and he did a really good job of this, of summarising the position of land and why we are where we are. And he managed to do that in about 5 minutes. So watch this. Any comments and questions, drop them in.
Well, I would say that what characterises Scotland, and indeed Britain to a lesser extent, is that we're an unreformed society. So most of continental Europe had revolution. Well, I mean, all of continental Europe experienced a revolutionary moment following the French Revolution. So the church's power was diminished, primogeniture ended, the lands of the church were given to local communes and municipalities. In fact, you can date this right back to 1525 in Lutherstadt, Wittenberg, what's called Wittenberg then, because my interest in Luther is not as a theologian, but as an economic reformer, because by inviting people not to speak directly to God through the Pope in Rome and inviting them to speak directly to God themselves, as part of that rebellion against the established church, he organised, and in fact the town council in Wittenberg organised, that the tithes, so that the tenths of economic production that were previously given to the Roman Church now went into the common chest of Wittenberg. And if you go to Lutherstadt Wittenberg today, you go to the Luther Museum, you'll see the common chest of Wittenberg. So literally that was the birth of modern municipal government and taxation, and that money was used to pay for welfare for orphans and to give bursaries to students to go and study at university. So in the aftermath of the French Revolution, that accelerated, obviously, and Europe, all of Europe had its revolutionary moments. And the basic fundamental reform in continental European countries was that children were given, to a greater or lesser degree, with a variety of codicils around it, the right to inherit land. Which means that if you go to France or Italy or Germany or Finland or wherever today, you'll find lots and lots of people owning rural land. We only abolished primogeniture in 1964, and still children have no legal right to inherit land. So if I own land, doesn't matter what scale, it could be a house or a garage or 10,000 hectare estate, and I have 5 children, I can give it all to Brett. In my will, if I wish, I can leave it to the Edinburgh Canton Dog Home, I can leave it to the SCOTONOMICS Festival. And my children have got absolutely no comeback. And that's the fundamental, it's not often talked about. But the other factor that would characterise it is our very, very weak, the weakest in Europe, system of local democracy. I mean, you go to most European countries, and many, not most, I would say, but yeah, well, many, and certainly if you include the regions, like the cantons in Switzerland or the départements in France, then the majority of decisions regulating land are taken not by the central state, in Edinburgh, Paris, or Bern, or wherever, they're taken by the local commune. I suppose that those are the two, and that related to that is our incoherent tax system. So we've got to conclude, we have a very unreformed land governance framework. That's the bottom line.
I mean, I guess I'll add 2 things to that. And I'm cautious about doing so just simply because Andy's the expert on Scottish land ownership, and I'm definitely not. But I think when you know something so well, like Andy does, you kind of sometimes you gloss over the stuff that's so obvious to you that it might not be obvious to everybody else. And I think, you know, one thing that's obvious about Scottish land ownership is the massive concentration in relatively few hands. That so much Scottish land, and particularly rural land, is obviously concentrated in an extraordinarily small number of hands, which is quite distinctive to Scotland compared to most other Western societies. You know, you can count on, you don't need many hands to count the people or families that own most of Scottish rural land. So that's the first thing I would add. And then I think the second thing I would add that also distinguishes Scotland from the rest of Britain in terms of land ownership were 2 other things. One is that other than forested land, there hasn't in recent history been as much public land ownership by the state in Scotland as there was in the rest of Britain. So one thing that has happened a lot in recent decades in Britain is that a lot of public land ownership has been lost to the private sector. That hasn't really happened in Scotland because there wasn't that much to lose from the public sector in the first place. And then the other thing I would add is that you know, there has been and we mentioned this a bit last night, there has been one relatively positive development in terms of Scottish land ownership in recent times that hasn't really happened in the UK, which is you know, a somewhat growing community land ownership in Scotland, which you haven't really seen in Britain. So Scottish communities have certain rights of first refusal on when land comes up for sale. I think in urban areas now as well as rural areas. I think it was first in rural areas, which doesn't exist in Britain. So there has been, it's relatively limited still in terms of the acreage, but that's a relatively positive phenomenon. But the basic reality is that Scottish land is predominantly owned by a very small number of people, families. And then secondly, another thing that Andy's work has shown is that there's still a relative lack of knowledge about a lot of that land ownership in terms of actual registration rates are still relatively low compared even to the rest of Britain.
So land, that land, the theme of land spread through a few of the other sessions. But what's your thoughts watching that one back here?
I couldn't really concentrate on a lot of the shows because I was concerned about what was happening round about me in the audience and to a certain extent, working. But I would really like to watch that one again because it's an area that Andy knows so much about, and I mean, I was so fascinated about the history of why we are where we are. That was really interesting for me. Super interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I really like this in-depth look because it's looking at land and land markets as an institution. And I know people who watch the show regularly will probably be aware of that. I class myself now as an institutional economist. And I think it's really important that we must understand these institutions, and land market is an institution. And I think if we don't understand the historic nature of land, we can't just assume to completely change when we become independent. We have to understand how we got there, and then we better understand how we move away from that. And I think Andy's work, and also the work to a lesser extent that Brett's done, really helps us understand the deep connections that we have as Scots to our land, but where land and the ownership of land fits into the overall British establishment, I think is really, really crucial. So yeah, it was mentioned quite a few times, and I really enjoyed doing that session. Next up, we've got a short MMT section. I tried not to mention MMT that much outside of the MMT sessions. So here's two sessions. We asked Dirk Ince to explain the need for fiscal frameworks and fiscal rules. So I'll bring this one up next.
Here, because the narrative is that fiscal rules are a very kind of technical understanding of how you should run an economy. So loads of economists got together, read loads of scientific papers, spent weeks, months looking at what the percentage of GDP equivalent to debt would be, and then they came up with this figure. Is that how fiscal rules develop?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, fiscal rules, I think we did do very well without fiscal rules in the post-World War II era. Okay, so countries in Europe didn't have fiscal rules. The US probably had the debt ceiling, but it didn't matter much. So the countries, they built up the welfare state, and inequality was coming down, wages were going up, employment was good. There were some problems that in the beginning minorities were ignored, but then later on also women got integrated into the workplace. And only later, basically, I think in Germany was in 2011 that they introduced a debt brake. So at some point, the economists claimed that in order not to run out of money, we have to have sustainable public finances. It's also in the European Union treaties and so on. But this is a conversation which is really odd, because when you look at it, I mean, the United Kingdom, just empirically speaking, the United Kingdom has a currency for something like 300 years. The public debt to GDP ratio is going up and down and up and down. And historically speaking, I think it's pretty much at the lower end right now. After the end of the Second World War, the ratio was 250% of public debt to GDP. So never ever did the country run out of money. And the Bank of England clearly is the monopoly supplier of money, of British pounds. And I remember that Boris Johnson in 2020 during COVID asked the Bank of England to allow the British government to spend without issuing gilts, without issuing government bonds. First they said no, then over the weekend they said in the Financial Times, we are thinking about it. And on Monday said, okay, but just 40 billion pounds.
Just 40 billion.
I mean, it clearly shows you who has all the power of the purse. And if the central bank is supporting, then the country cannot run out of its own currency. So when you're introducing something like a debt brake or some kind of fiscal framework, the first question should always be, why would you want to do that? You cannot run out of money. And in many instances, this is the only excuse that is given for a fiscal framework, for debt brake, is that it helps with fiscal sustainability. So there's two possibilities. We could either say, this is just wrong, it's not how it works, or we can say, let us have a different kind of definition of fiscal sustainability. So we say that fiscal sustainability is when you have full employment and price stability. It's a little bit more indirect, but it's also a possibility to change the conversation and say, look, what we want is we want to have an economy that works for all. And if that is what's happening, then we also have tax revenues and we have full employment, which will stabilize the tax revenues some more. So it's a compromise in a way that we could use. But I think that this idea of a debt brake and also the fiscal framework in the United Kingdom, which is just a political thing, I mean, it's just an excuse for politicians not to act, saying that money is somehow scarce. And that really is shameful, to be honest.
So yeah, a real solid MMT point, and more of a heterodox economics point as well, as around fiscal frameworks made by Dirk. We've got another short clip from Eric Tamoyne, and we said to Eric, if everything Dirk says is correct, and we know that governments can't run out of money, and we know this as MMT scholars, what stories can we tell that help people understand that this is actually the real world and not just our interpretation of what's going on? And in a minute and 5, I think he came up with a brilliant little story.
Every time a government has faced critical issues, it has raised to the challenge. And finance, the fiscal side, has always been a big part of that. This is true more recently with COVID. This is true during World War II. and this is true for any periods of crisis that we have seen, somehow in that time we can find the money, and we never question anything about that. Okay, what we're saying is that we should apply what we know very well in time of emergency. We should apply that in times of peace and quiet. Rethink our policy making toward a more rational way of thinking about it, instead of fears that are not grounded in any economic data or any institutional realities. And that's it.
So yeah, as you said, Karen, that's it. You know, we need to say to people, they found money to bail out the banks in the financial crisis. They found money for COVID. They found money for rearmament. They need to find money for to increase people's well-being and for the things that you think are important. And the evidence is just so obvious now in a way that it wasn't maybe 15, 20 years ago. But it is a powerful story, that, isn't it? Because people know now that it's true. The money is there. The government just needs to want to spend it.
Yeah, but I think it's also important for us to emphasise that we do think that taxation is important as well, but not for the reason of bringing in income for the government. It's important as a social engineering tool. And if you have been creating massive inequality in your country for years and years, then perhaps you're not doing a good job of running a country 101, I would say. And you know, my big fear, and I've said this to you a few times, is that history shows us that you continue on this path of creating massive inequality, it will lead to fascism, which could lead to war. And this is what we really, this is part of the reason why I'm doing this program with you and why I started Modern Money Scotland, because this is the fear that drives me in some ways.
Yeah, and that's a nice introduction to Clara Mattei, whose book, The Capital Order, was subtitled How Austerity Leads to Fascism. And that was a theme that spread across the 2 days, was, you know, you get fiscal austerity now, and then you get more fiscal austerity, but what happens at the end of that process? And Clara's historical analysis is that fascism happens at the end of that. And we can already see that playing out, not just in the States, but also with the rise of Reform and other right-wing parties in Europe. So, you know, this is very much a live issue. Now, we actually, the clip I've got for you is a point in history where capitalism almost failed, and we almost were able to rewrite the sort of structure, the economic structure, after the end of First World War. Clara, in 2 minutes, explains what happened and why that wasn't successful and why actually it ended up in austerity. This is a brilliant little clip. I'll put this one up for you now.
Can you tell us about Clydesdale? Because this is a particularly interesting example at our Scotonomic Festival, which is there were workers' councils which were revolutionary in the sense that they challenged the ownership of industry and were really felt, as you describe in the book, as quite a threat, including the Clydesdale movement for workers. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yes, exactly. So what is interesting is that the war was kind of the context in which these assemblies and self-governance that stemmed from the fact that a lot of workers saw, the rank and file saw that the unions were allying with the state that was repressing the workers in order to increase the rate of exploitation to achieve greater production for the war. So that this idea that unions were not enough. Unions were achieving a lot of power, and that was also unprecedented in the history of Britain. But these unions were also seen as somehow too elitist for many rank and file. So the self-organization coming from spontaneous assemblies really gave a sense that workers could take over production on their own and govern a production distribution through democratic decision making that was indeed horizontal rather than vertical. And this is something that, Antonio Gramsci in l'Ordine Nuovo movement in Italy took a lot of inspiration from the shop steward movement in Britain. And in Italy, the situation escalated to the point that all factories were occupied and self-governed for more than a month in September, August and September of 1920. So really a moment in which the fact that capitalism was going to survive was not at all obvious. And this is something that was not just being said by, the radical workers. It was being said by the Times, the London Times, or all of the bourgeois newspapers were kind of admitting that the system until then had proven to be anachronistic, incapable of dealing with people's social issues, and that ultimately forms of welfare state were pushing to really challenge the priority of private profit making with respect to priorities that were much more social and ingrained in people's requests for a different society after the sacrifice of the war.
Clara was definitely a highlight for me across the show. I think she had such a wide scope. She started her opening address talking about Palestine and the violence of austerity, and then she covered so much of a kind of geographical and also a historical spread. And there she was just saying capitalism almost failed. It's possible that capitalism can be completely changed. I think that was a fascinating story that she told.
Yeah, she has huge passion and huge knowledge. She's a great asset to Scotonomics. Absolutely. Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah, she is fantastic. Okay, along similar lines, and I put these two together because Clara was saying capitalism almost collapsed in 1920, and Brett Christophers is doing a really good job here, a little 4-minute clip of saying this is how bad it's got. When the state withdraws from providing services and just allows capitalists and capitalism to take over, this is what you end up with. This for me is an absolute highlight. I know you haven't seen this, Kim, but I hope you really like this one. Please, any thoughts and comments, drop them in.
Right, so if you're comparing the state as a landlord with the likes of BlackRock or Macquarie, I mean, people might say, well, I know someone who is a council tenant in the 70s and 80s, and they had a bloody hard time getting the damp fixed as well. They're not particularly good. Could you not regulate the asset managers and just say, look, if you're going to own housing and you're going to benefit from the rent, then we're going to impose this set of obligations on you. You're going to have to fix the boiler within X, and in fact, you're going to have to green it all if they're going to make the returns they want.
Absolutely. So it's a great question. So let me say two things in answer to that. So first is like why I'm definitely not is like a romanticizer of public sector ownership. I think that there are historically and today there are just as many examples, or at least many examples of bad public sector custodianship of socially critical assets as there are private sectors. There's bad and good on the public sector side, as well as on the private side. So we shouldn't romanticize it. What I would say there, though, is that I think that what I would say is that at least with public sector ownership, you have the possibility, if not the necessity or inevitability, of more socially progressive outcomes. So it can go awry, but at least you have the possibility of potentially something better. So that's the first thing I would say. Yeah. Second thing I would say, which is to the point about regulation. I mean, that's the theory, right? Which is that you have private sector ownership, and then you regulate them to make sure they don't step out of line. Now, there are lots of problems with that. One of them, and in a way the most significant one, I think, is that, and you only need to follow the news to see this, is that the water sector in the UK is a classic example of this. Over the years, whenever Ofwat, the UK water regulator, or the government says, look, we've had enough of this nonsense, we are going to clamp down, we're going to be a more strenuous regulator than we have in the past. The very next day, the investment community and their trade associations come out and say, well, if you clamp down too hard, we're going to pull out. It's not going to be a friendly environment for private sector investment anymore. And as soon as they do that, without want to, use bad language, government shit their pants and basically say, okay, we're not going to come down hard on regulation after all, because it'll have a chilling effect on private sector investment. So they play that card every time by threatening to effectively have an investment strike. And that's, again, if public sector ownership and investment is not on the table as an alternative, what are governments going to do? They're always going to capitulate in that context. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is, yes, regulation, even if you forget about that threat of investment strike, yes, regulation in theory, but the reality is that the UK's regulators have been consistently gamed or captured by the community that they are supposed to regulate. And often the regulation ends up being written or co-written by the very industry that is supposed to be being regulated. So that's the second thing I would say. And then I think the third thing is that the industry has learned, and I'm not just talking, I'm talking across the board. I'm talking about water, I'm talking about electricity, but I'm particularly talking about water here. Industry has learned that it's more they would never say this, but it's more profitable to do a terrible job and then receive fines that amount to nothing more than a slap on the wrist. Like if you are Thames Water, not to want to continue to pick on them because it's one example of many, what they've learned, what they've been shown over the last 15, 20 years is you can just release however much effluent you want. You don't have to repair the leaks and so on. And then you might get like a 20 million fine. Well,
cost of doing business.
Yeah, I mean, but compare that to the billions that they've been able to. I mean, it's embarrassing, frankly. Yeah. And so, they would never say this, but to my mind, the business model is let's just behave as badly as we can because we know that we're never going to be punished for it in meaningful terms. And if you're thinking as a purely rational economic actor, that's what you would do. If your goal is to maximize shareholder value, which it is, of course, that's what you do.
I mean, that's a fascinating insight, isn't it, with the example? And, and Brett is saying the system is designed not to punish, but to encourage water executives to dump shit into the system. And that's the whole system is designed for that. So expecting executives not to do that is expecting them to go completely against the system. And I think that just for me just shows how far we've come in that, in that modern capitalist period when we have that approach to business of maximizing shareholder revenue and assuming that the punishment is never going to be more than what you're gaining or what you're earning from profit from doing the thing that is causing harm.
So it's also, especially with the water, which is so fundamental to life, that it seems to show a lack of political participation. And, as a community, if you think of a smaller community and you have a problem, then you usually chat the doors, go around your neighbours and say, we need to maybe look at this problem. Then you maybe form a group. You might get yourself constituted. So you form a sort of governance group. You try and get things together. And essentially, that's how a government is created, right? And that's what we did a long time ago. We created government. We chose people who we thought would be good representatives. Yet they're not solving the fundamental problem of your water supply. I just do not understand why England is not up in arms about this. This is your water supply. And, the point that he makes is it's just a little bit of a cost for them, a fine. And the money that they're making. Come on, England, get angrier. Oh, I can't hear you.
That's a really good point. And that's just the externalities that are within the orthodox economic framework, is that these external costs will in some way work their way through the system, but they don't, because they're just, as Andy Verity said there, just the cost of doing business. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. And you can see it in the States as well. I mean, how many stories do we see from like Flint, Michigan, people, setting fire to the water that's coming out because of the fracking. And it is such a fundamental part of life that you would expect more people in the global north. Now, I know, having done a lot of research on what happens when the IMF arrives in the global north, they're often one of the first things that in the global south, the one thing that the IMF suggests is that countries privatize their water. And this is where this huge uprising in many examples when the IMF have tried to do this, and they've actually had to back down in several instances when people realise what's been taken away. But I think it's just been so gradual in the UK that certainly in England, they're not reacting in the way that you would expect. You know, it's not like you're expecting people to be radical. It's there's shit in their water because the wealthiest people in society are earning money rather than fixing your water. You know, it's as Charles said, that it's difficult to disagree with that. It explains the mess we're in now. I don't know if mess was a euphemism or a pun there from Charles, but thanks to that. Well, we've got one very short clip that I wanted to show you, because for me, I think when you put together a conference, you want yourself to come on a journey in the same way that you want the audience to come on the journey. And even though I put, the program together, invited the speakers, I still really learned something about my perspective of what I think is a fundamentally important policy. And I think it's going to shape a little bit more of the work that Scotonomics is going to do over the next 24 months. So here's me having a little bit of an epiphany.
That's why I think the job guarantee, a government job guarantee, is such a strong policy, because you can say there is a job for you if you want it. It's a well-paid, meaningful job. Middle-class people underestimate what that is, to saying to someone who's working class that they have a good, well-paid, safe job. I mean, that is a structural change that they will not have experienced. I just wish more people would get behind this one policy of a job guarantee. And right now, interest rates are high. Government are pushing people into unemployment, and they're saying to people who are unemployed, and especially disabled people, get a job. At the same time, the central bank is creating conditions to make it harder to get a job. And when the economy starts getting better, it's not unemployed people who get a job. It's people who are already working, work more hours. And one of the biggest pulls when the economy starts to improve is people who have retired or who are semi-retired. All these people are brought into the workforce before people who've been long-term unemployed. It is incredibly difficult, and it is so harmful that we are pushing these people, blaming them for not getting a job when there's this whole macroeconomic structure. And a job guarantee is one thing I think can make a big, big difference.
So I know you pushed the Lord Natalie Bennett. Sorry, Natalie. You pushed her quite hard on the session that I didn't see when she was speaking about UBI. We actually had a session where we had UBI versus job guarantee. So there was quite a lot they were speaking about. Explain to us again, Karen, why you're so much in favour of a job guarantee.
I think probably the first reason is I realised that the reason you have a currency is in order to create an economy, and that everyone participates in the economy in some way, abilities that they can. And the idea that we pay people to maybe do things that they might quite like to do, and possibly have another job as well, won't make your country work. Oh, I'm sorry, it won't. If you want your country to function, sometimes some people are going to have to do some jobs that are not necessarily ones that they really, really love. And I mean, certainly for me, it took years to get to where I am just now and do the things that I'm doing. And I educated myself. I did a lot of courses, etc., etc. So I think I very much recognise that you can't run a country and just give people money to just kind of do the thing that they quite like to do, because that might not work.
Speaking against the UBI.
So yeah, and then there's the complications of it. So for example, someone who's disabled, then they need extra help, to fit out their house, to help them be mobile, all those things. And then also someone in Arbroath is going to need a different UBI from someone in Edinburgh. So then it starts to get complicated. It's not just a flat payment. And that's one of the arguments for it, is that it would be simple. But no, it won't be simple. Social Security is not simple. And I think that what a lot of UBIers want is that they want to be not in a country that has a really crap social security system. That's what a lot of UBI folk want, I think, really, in reality. Because when you look at it, it becomes quite complex once you start thinking about all those different factors that are needed.
Yeah.
And a job guarantee, it means that, you know, if you can't work, you can't work. But if you can work and you want to work, there will be a job there for you. And if you have you're a parent that you want to stay close to, or children in a school, then you can get a job close to them, and that would be the guarantee. It might not be your dream job, but it will pay a living wage and you will be treated with dignity. And these are the things I think actually most people want.
Yeah, I would agree. As I said, I certainly think I need to do a little bit more detail. I mean, I spoke at an event in St Andrews University more than a year ago now, that was concentrating on the job guarantee, and I've always been a fan of it, but I think it seems to be, you know, we're always looking for a policy that's a bit of a silver bullet, and I don't think those policies exist. But I think a job guarantee is a really important policy, and certainly for the independent supporters who are watching, I think that if we had a next independence, let's say there's a referendum and it was underpinned by a few policies, which I think is absolutely essential, I think saying that an independent Scotland would be a Scotland where no one who wanted a job didn't have a job. And when you explain how easy that is to do, then I think you get lots of people on board. And obviously from our perspective, it says that you can only do this, and this is a fundamental point, you can only do this when you issue the currency. Yeah. So these are things that I think align really well with a lot of the things that we cover on Scotonomics. Well, that was an 8-clip, 45-minute summary of our 15 sessions, almost 12 hours of content. And as I said at the start, we've put the content on our Patreon site. It's £3 if you wanted to view an individual session, and it's £10 if you want to view all of the sessions that took place on Friday or Saturday. And please do, if you like the look of some of those clips, jump onto the Patreon and really help us out, build up a little bit of a stock and pay our speakers for the ones who attended this year and also next year. We're definitely going to have a festival next year. We know one thing, it's not going to be in Dundee. We're going to take it somewhere else. Kieran and I will be chatting about exactly where that is, and maybe we'll go out to our community and ask as well. Well, thanks so much for joining us. We're back. We've got a session 2 weeks, which is going to be a brilliant live session with one of the authors of The Self-Financing State, which really explains in huge detail how the UK government creates money. And then the following 2 weeks after that, we've got a wonderful session, a look at sustainable economics with a professor from Exeter. So we're back with some fantastic content. I hope you can join us in a couple of weeks. And as I said, please do visit us on our Patreon, even if you just want to subscribe and follow a lot of things that we do for free. Thanks very much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your night, and we'll see you soon. Bye, Kieran. Bye, everyone.